Good afternoon. This is a reading of the book Simple Messages on Romans by Harold S. Martin. We are doing this in connection with our Bible study series on the book of Romans. Okay, in this book, Simple Messages on Romans, we are now in chapter 7. This is about Israel's past and God's sovereignty. Our text is Romans chapter 9 verses 1 to 29. Let's read. The third major portion of the book of Romans gives some guidelines regarding God's dealing with Israel. Paul explained the glories of God's grace in the early chapters of Romans, but his heart was heavy because he realized that these glories were not being enjoyed by his own fellow countrymen, the Jews. There were some Jews who became Christians, but as a whole, the Jews rejected Christ. Paul's heart was filled with deep concern and heaviness. He says he would gladly suffer eternally if only his kinsmen according to the flesh would be saved. Romans chapter 9 to 11 deals with the relation of the Jew to the gospel. The Jews were God's chosen people. They have a special place in God's plan. And yet when God's Son came into the world, they rejected him and crucified him. How can all this be explained? How can we explain the fact that God's people crucified God's Son? What effect does this have on God's program for the future? Is God all through with Israel, or does Israel still have a place in God's plan? Point 1. The problem set forth, chapter 9, verses 1 to 5. Many of the Christians in Rome were Jews who had accepted the Messiah, but they had trouble reconciling the Old Testament promises to Israel as a nation with the setting aside of the nation. The nation as a whole rejected Christ, and in AD 70, the temple was burned and the Jewish people were scattered. The country of Palestine became a desert inhabited by wandering Arabs. Gentiles were accepting the Messiah, while the Jews as a nation were hardened against him. This didn't seem to harmonize with the Old Testament prophecies in which God had promised to bless the world through Israel. Now Israel had been set aside, and it seemed that the ancient promises were of none effect. Romans chapter 9 up to chapter 11 gives some light on the subject. Israel had many privileges. Romans chapter 9 verses 4 to 5 lists 8 marks of divine favor shown toward Israel. She had the adoption, verse 4. The nation Israel was adopted as God's chosen family. She was brought into a special relationship with God in distinction from all the other nations of earth. Israel also had the glory, verse 4. This refers to the Shekinah glory, the cloud which overshadowed Israel by day, and the pillar of fire which led and protected them by night. No other nation experienced anything like it. Israel also had the law. Verse 4. Israel could never plead ignorance of God's will because God had given them his law through Moses. Furthermore, Israel had the service, still in verse 4. The temple and the tabernacle with its daily sacrifices and its yearly festivals was peculiar to Israel. Israel also had the promises, also in verse 4. These include the forgiveness of sins, the inheritance of the promised land, and the coming of the Messiah. Verse 5 says Israel had the fathers, that is, the ancestors of the Jewish people, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, had been examples of faith and godliness. Israel was blessed above all with the Christ. Still in verse 5, the Messiah was born of the people Israel. These privileges show the bounty of Israel's blessings. Yet in spite of all these privileges, Israel as a nation turned its back on God and rejected the very Messiah that she brought into the world. God had blessed Israel in so many ways. He dwelled with them. He traveled with them. He overshadowed them with his presence. He said in one place that Israel was graven on his hand. And yet when Israel sinned, God scattered and destroyed them without mercy. God loves his people, but God's love is not a mushy kind of love that overlooks sin. In justice, God had punished Israel and set the nation aside. As a result, the temple was burned, the people were scattered among the nations, and the Gentiles were grafted in instead. The promise to bless the world through Israel seems to be disrupted. How does all this fit with the purpose and plan of God? That is the problem. We will continue with point 2 next time. God bless everyone.